House of Ashes is the third in a planned series of 8 games set in the Dark Pictures universe, ostensibly begun with the release of Until Dawn in 2015. Created by British developers Supermassive Games, not to be confused with Supergiant Games, creators of Hades, Bastion, Transistor and Pyre, the Dark Pictures anthology currently consists of 2019's Man of Medan, 2020's Little Hope, and now House of Ashes. Each game is a self-contained horror experience, with it not being necessary to play the previous games to understand the plot of the current one. Although based on a few small hints, there is a possibility that there's an overarching story, or at least a connecting thread, that may be looming. I've never reviewed either Man of Medan or Little Hope, largely because I was preoccupied with other things at the time, but in short, Man of Medan is fascinatingly bad, and though it does have a few interesting moments, it's often far too preoccupied with trying to be scary instead of building the tension and atmosphere that Until Dawn crafted fairly well. It also suffered from a litany of technical issues, particularly on PC, and the version that I played on Game Pass crashed so frequently that it became almost unplayable. On the other hand, Little Hope was a huge improvement over its predecessor, and although there were a number of individuals decrying the ending as being it was all a dream, I never saw it this way. Without wishing to spoil too much, it felt like less of a all a dream cop-out and more like Silent Hill before it. The town of Little Hope, steeped in a horrific past as it was, made real what was necessary for an individual to come to terms with the tragedy of their past. I liked it a lot, and after Man of Medan, it was certainly a step in the right direction. Don't get me wrong, the term game is a bit fast and loose for this style. The amount of control that you have over characters is quite limited, with brief moments of direct control, frequently interrupted by cutscenes in which you make 1 or 2 dialogue choices or push through a series of QuickTime events to progress the death machine. For the most part, emphasis is on making the correct snap decisions to ensure that the main characters survive their ordeal, with some aspects reliant on character relationships, and others requiring quick reflexes and meta-narrative knowledge of the game itself, provided through premonitions that can be found as collectibles throughout the game. Each premonition shows an event that most often results in the death of a character or ominously forewarns of future dangers, though all of these are optional and missable. Generally, getting the best outcome never feels particularly difficult. Not being a raging arsehole is usually a good way to begin, but that doesn't make it any less satisfying to survive the night with 5 final girls instead of 1, or indeed, none. The bulk of House of Ashes takes place towards the end of the Iraq War proper, which technically happened between March and April of 2003, with the following official 8 years being an occupation. A group of thoroughly deplorable soldiers are camped out in an undisclosed area of Iraq, helmed by the quote-unquote Queen Bitch Rachel King, a CIA operative, and First Lieutenant Colchek, whose operations are interrupted when King's estranged husband, Eric, arrives and assumes control of the operation, in the mind to seek out WMDs alleged to be buried beneath the surface of a nearby farm. Prior to this is a brief tutorialized sequence set in ancient Akkad, 2231 BC, in which the king Naram Sin is struggling to temper an onset of plague and famine, resorting to ritualistic sacrifices that predictably fall awry. In the midst of an assault from the Gutian soldiers, an ancient evil apparently stirs beneath their temple, slaughtering everyone. It's not long before the modern-day military team are trapped underground and must work together to find a way out and escape the horrors that lie in wait. One thing that Supermassive Games have been consistently good at, with the one notable exception, has been introducing a series of massive arseholes as main characters and making you feel detached from them to the extent that you don't much care if they die, to begin with. They then use the remainder of the game to slowly pivot you into at least feeling sympathetic towards them, and that hasn't changed here, as deliberately choosing to push characters into revealing the hidden heart aspects of themselves will bring out the humanity within, despite the caricature of a facade that many of them have. An excellent example in Ashes is Jason Colchek, very much the stereotypical American soldier boy with mum jokes and all. When he was introduced, I hated him, but by the end of the game, having made the effort to convince him to open up about a particularly difficult event, I found myself feeling rather sorry for him instead. The majority of the characters are like this, although the strongest exception is Salim, an Iraqi ground forces troop who is disillusioned with his life and wants nothing more than to be home with his son, Zayn. Whether or not Salim engages with the Americans is largely up to the player, and like all the previous games, it is entirely possible for alliances to never be forged at all when death is as persistent a threat as it is in House of Ashes. The game does suffer from a slow opening, getting the player used to the banter between the Marines, controlling their raid upon the target locations of the alleged WMDs, and deciding how to deal with the locals before them. However, despite the slow start, the game ramps up in intensity the moment the buried Temple of Akkad is unleashed, and it's not long before utter chaos ensues. When House of Ashes kicks, it kicks hard, and from that point onwards it is a relentless tour de force of twitchy trigger fingers, peering around corners and uncovering the remnants of those who came before. The tension is oppressive, and by the game's finale, at which time I still somehow had all 5 player characters alive, that final moment of relief as the last QTE was completed successfully was a genuine weight off my chest. Where Man of Medan felt a little silly and Little Hope felt consistently tense with brief bursts of action to punctuate the long silences, House of Ashes shifts gears from slow and patient to balls-to-the-wall violence, and it is honestly fantastic. That said, the first 1 to 2 hours suffer from some rather abrupt loading screens that cause the shifts in character perspectives to feel incredibly unnatural. You'll have just finished a line of dialogue when suddenly you're teleported into the centre of an action sequence that lasts for barely a few minutes, which is interrupted by another loading screen, and then it drops you right back into the conversation you were just having. This problem irons itself out after a short while, but the result is that the pacing of the initial 1 to 2 hours of gameplay is very jarring. Continuing on from the trends set by all of its predecessors, Ashes also features the horrific Uncanny Valley waxworks, no doubt bought from Madame Tussauds bargain bin in the form of its main characters. The big name this time around is Ashley Tisdale of High School Musical, Sweet Life and something else, I'm sure, fame. Anyway, just as with prior entries, the characters are all bizarrely shiny and unnatural, edging just on the verge of being realistic portrayals of human beings, or as one of my favourite streamers said,
can I just say, by the way, the characters in the game probably look just like their actor. I don't know any of these actors, right? They probably look just like the actor, but like an alien wearing the skin of the actor rather than the actor themselves.
If you've played any of the past games, you probably won't be fazed by the character models, and House of Ashes is not quite as Uncanny Valley as Until Dawn was, with there being more characters who don't look like melted putty than there are those that do. But Rachel's appearance in particular is uncanny as all hell. It's also not helped by some incredibly disjointed and awkward body animations. Whilst the majority are fairly standard for the style that Supermassive have cultivated, there were several times throughout the game where characters would jerk their arms or legs around, their heads would crack at awkward angles, or their eyes would just be terrifyingly shiny. It was never so bad as to be game-breaking, but it was certainly distracting. Despite the few negatives, the game does feature several quality of life improvements over its predecessors. The camera has changed from a occasionally dynamic fixed angle to a traditional third-person camera with 360-degree movement. It pulls in close for the appropriate claustrophobic tunnels and vice versa in larger areas, allowing for a more involved and in-depth view of your surroundings as you traverse the environment. By extension, this makes controlling your character much easier, although they do still have the quirky bouncing off objects movement style of earlier games, just nowhere near as obnoxious. Coupled with a dedicated button for your torch, which points where you direct the camera towards, it allows for far more immersion into the environments, with you peering round corners, checking ceilings, and seeking out any little details that you can find in the dark. Using your torch isn't necessary for finding the items you need to progress, or for picking up on secrets hidden in the shadows, but casting your light across a room will highlight any interactable objects with a shimmer, useful if you're struggling. The game also offers difficulty selection for its QuickTime events, with challenging being analogous to normal difficulty and that being the option that I chose. Throughout the game, the QTEs felt fair on this difficulty, and I only failed 3 of them throughout the duration of my 5-ish hours, with one of them being the heartbeat minigame that has persisted through the series since Man of Medan. It generally isn't too difficult unless you're a pillock like me and press the button too early in a panic. Still, much like all of these kinds of games, some QTEs can be failed without there being huge detriments, as there are usually other options present to take advantage of, but when it matters the most you will absolutely know, especially towards the final act. More than any of the previous games, House of Ashes also features far more interesting options for progression, with several opportunities to deliberately fail a QTE, not necessarily meaning a character death, but rather leading to future opportunities. An early example is when playing Lieutenant Colchek, you are given the option to shoot a fleeing civilian, realising a moment after the fact that Salim is standing behind you. Some decisions may seem to have a negative impact initially, but can very well open up interesting routes much later down the line. Choices made in the game's opening hours also visibly affect the ending, and without wishing to spoil, I was especially impressed that one very early option meant the difference between a character's final ending, if they survived at all. It's rare that these games really prove themselves when they insist that all of your decisions matter, but with House of Ashes, this was the first game where I truly felt that my choices had any real impact on the story, rather than the game desperately trying to railroad said story to the ending that it wanted. Something I would have liked to see would have involved tighter spaces, smaller tunnels, perhaps having to struggle to emerge through the other side, like The Descent, but in video game form. That said, it probably wouldn't have quite fit the tone of the game, given that this is a group of soldiers, not cave divers. Something for the future, perhaps. If you didn't like any of the previous games, or just don't find enjoyment in something you have minimal control over, House of Ashes won't do anything to change your mind. But if you don't mind this style of interactive movies, as it were, or if you've enjoyed Supermassive's games so far, you will probably find plenty here to fill a 5-hour void in your gaming schedule. It's got some pretty great acting, with serious props going to the character of Salim and his actor, who has the single most appropriate reaction to his awful situation out of everyone. And the game's final act takes a turn in a direction I really did not expect. It's batshit crazy in the best possible way. And I thoroughly enjoyed the camaraderie and bravado that the game fostered from its initial bag of dicks masquerading as humans. If you're looking for something to satiate your appetite before Fatal Frame 5's re-release this coming Friday, House of Ashes might just do that for you. It's the best of the 3 Dark Pictures so far, and I can only hope that Supermassive continue their stride with the upcoming 4th game.